Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're tackling a really compelling subject, the history, identity, and, well, the ongoing struggles of the Assyrian people in Syria. They're an ancient and indigenous ethno-religious group, with roots stretching back millennia.
It's such a crucial story to understand. Yeah, we've really gone through some extensive material detailing their long journey through history right up to their incredibly difficult experiences during the Syrian Civil War and the significant challenges they still face today.
Absolutely. So our aim here is to sort of pull out the most important insights from all this research to give you a real understanding of the Assyrian story and, its place within the complex reality of Syria.
Makes sense.
Okay, so let's kick things off with something that really struck me. Did you know the name Syria itself is probably a corruption of Assyria? Yeah, dating all the way back to the 9th century BC. That single linguistic link, it just speaks volumes, doesn't it? About a deep, often overlooked historical connection.
It really does.
Yeah.
It's fascinating how that echo in the name hints at this historical reality that's, well, profoundly shaped the region.
Exactly. So, over the next while, we're going to explore their ancient Mesopotamian roots, how their distinct Christian and linguistic identity took shape, their involvement in the political landscape, the devastating impact of the Syrian Civil War on their communities,
Right.
the current hurdles they're facing, and finally, maybe what the future might hold. Let's start by digging into those ancient roots.
Okay. Well, their connection to Mesopotamia is incredibly deep. It places them in the region for thousands of years, long before many other groups who now live there.
Right.
We see archaeological evidence, from sites like Jarmo culture, that's like 7100 BC,
Wow.
and Tel Hassuna, around 6000 BC.
Wow.
It clearly establishes a very, very long human presence in their ancestral lands.
And from these ancient settlements, we see the rise of major Assyrian power centers, right? Like
Yeah.
Ashur.
Yes, Assur, rising to prominence around the 25th century BC, and of course, the iconic city of Nineveh, the heart of the Neo-Assyrian Empire.
Okay.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, the Assyrian Empire, it exerted significant influence over much of what is now Syria for a really substantial period. We're talking roughly 2000 to 599 BC.
So not just a brief moment.
No, not a fleeting occupation. It was a sustained, dominant presence. And like you said, the evolution of the name Syria from Assyria around the 9th century BC just underscores that historical weight.
It's almost like the land itself carries a memory of their name, and that influence didn't just vanish when the main empire fell, did it? There were continuations.
That's right. You had these Neo-Assyrian states, like Osirian in northeast Syria, which existed until the mid-3rd century AD. That's centuries after the fall of Nineveh, showing a persistent Assyrian presence and influence right there in Syria.
So when we talk about their claims as an indigenous people, this isn't some recent argument. It's a connection stretching back millennia. Really highlights their historical rights and maybe aspirations for some kind of self-governance. The Neo-Assyrian Empire is pretty sophisticated, wasn't it? Militarily, administratively.
It was, and that raises a really important point about how that historical legacy is viewed today. While it undeniably strengthens their claims to being indigenous, capable of self-governance, that imperial past could also, understandably, create suspicion or even resentment among other regional groups who were, once under Assyrian rule. It's a complex historical factor to navigate.
Absolutely. Now, their identity isn't solely based on these ancient Mesopotamian roots. The adoption of Christianity is just as crucial, wouldn't you say?
Well, without a doubt. Their early embrace of Christianity, starting maybe 1st century AD, solidifying by the 3rd century, that was transformative. The region of Athura, parts of northeast Syria, became this vital center for Eastern Christianity and the development of Syriac literature.
Right.
This era saw the founding of key churches like the Assyrian Church of the East and the Syriac Orthodox Church.
And that religious affiliation, it's not just about personal faith, is it? It seems deeply woven into their modern Assyrian identity, intrinsically linked with their language, their culture.
Precisely. And while the history of the Assyrian Church has seen periods of, let's say, internal division, sometimes influenced by external factors, later by missionary activities in the 19th century, the Church has consistently played this crucial role in preserving Assyrian culture and, importantly, the Syriac language. It's been a real anchor for their cultural identity through some very turbulent times.
Like a cultural lifeline, almost.
Yeah.
And their contributions weren't just religious, were they? Even after the rise of Islam.
No, what's remarkable is their continued influence. During the Umayyad and Abbasid caliphates, you had Assyrians holding significant positions in administration. And crucially, they were instrumental in translating Greek science and philosophy into Arabic.
Ah, the translation movement.
Exactly. Figures like Sarjan ibn Mansur and Hunayn ibn Ishaq were central to this massive intellectual transfer.
So Christianity is foundational to their ethnic identity, tied to language, heritage. The churches have been vital. But those past divisions you mentioned, within the church itself, that must have created some obstacles to unity later on.
They have. That historical fragmentation has sometimes complicated efforts towards, say, unified political action in more recent times. It's an internal dynamic that, external actors have occasionally tried to exploit.
Right. Now, jumping forward in history quite a bit, the modern Assyrian presence in Syria, as we know it today, is largely a result of some incredibly tragic events, isn't it? The Sifo genocide.
Yes, the Sifo. Between 1914 and 1920, during the last years of the Ottoman Empire, it was devastating, hundreds of thousands killed. Survivors were forced to flee their ancestral lands in what's now Turkey.
And they sought refuge in northeastern Syria.
That's right, establishing communities in areas like Tel Tamer, Kamishli, Ahosaka Governorate.
And tragically, that wasn't the end of the forced migrations. The Simile massacre in Iraq in 1933, that triggered another wave.
It did. Around 9,000 more Assyrians seeking safety, settling in the Khabur River Valley near Tal Tamir.
Okay.
And what's interesting here is the role of the French Mandate and the League of Nations in sort of facilitating these settlements. The French even gave them a degree of preferential treatment because they were Christian.
Which sounds helpful, but maybe had unintended consequences.
Well, exactly. It provided a temporary haven, sure, but it also, unfortunately, created tensions with other communities in the region. A new urban elite emerged among the Assyrians, which caused some friction.
It's a really complex picture. Refuge offered, but also sowing seeds of future discord. And they developed the Khabur region significantly, didn't they, agriculturally?
They did. It became known for wheat, grapes, dairy. They made it very productive. But this period also saw a growing hostility from Arab nationalists who saw their presence as tied to French colonialism, which led to civil strife and hindered early movements for any kind of autonomy.
So their settlement, it wasn't a choice, was it? It was pure survival. That must have just profoundly shaped their collective memory, fostering distrust of authorities, this powerful desire for self-preservation.
Precisely. And that temporary preferential treatment. While maybe well-intentioned humanitarian aid, it ultimately created long-term vulnerabilities, fostered resentment, undermined integration, security.
Taught between larger forces.
Exactly. A very precarious position.
It paints a picture of a community just constantly striving for survival.
Okay,
let's dive deeper into the core of their identity, their culture and religion. And the Syriac language has to be fundamental here.
Yes, absolutely. The Syriac language, in its modern Neo-Aramaic dialects like Syriac, it represents an unbroken linguistic link directly back to ancient Mesopotamia.
3 millennia.
Roughly, yeah. Spoken in the region for about 3,000 years. And classical Syriac from 3rd century Edessa is still vital liturgically and literarily for many Syriac Christians.
It's incredible, that continuity. From Akkadian, then Aramaic, becoming the lingua franca of the Assyrian Empire way back 10th century BC.
Under Tiglath-Pileser III, it became official.
Right through to today. But sadly, it's a language facing serious threats now.
Tragically, yes. UNESCO classifies Syriac as definitely endangered. It's a combination of factors: emigration, where younger generations might not pick it up fluently, acculturation, and just the ongoing political instability and persecution in their homeland.
And those political factors are actively undermining its survival. Forced closure of schools, imposing curricula that ignore their language and history.
Yes. And what's particularly concerning is this impossible dilemma they face with education. They're often forced to choose between the central Syrian government's curriculum, which includes Sharia law, and is actually banned by the ADNK, the Kurdish-led administration in the northeast.
Right.
And the Kurdish-imposed ADNE's curriculum, which itself faces criticism for historical revisionism, maybe even glorifying groups involved in past violence against Assyrians.
So neither option really supports their heritage.
Not adequately, no. Choosing the Syrian curriculum risks retaliation from 8As. Choosing the 8As, one might provoke Turkish aggression from across the border, who see the curriculum as promoting terrorism. It's a terrible bind. Many Assyrian schools have just been forced to shut down.
So for the community, preserving their language isn't just tradition, it's an act of political resistance. And the diaspora, NGOs, they're stepping in.
Exactly. Organizations like the Assyrian Aid Society of Iraq, Largely diaspora-funded, they play a vital role funding lecturers, providing textbooks, critical support from outside.
It really highlights how these policies banning curricula, harassing teachers, it's a direct assault on Assyrian identity and self-determination. Feels like deliberate cultural erasure. Now, alongside language, the diversity within their Christian denominations is another key feature.
Yes, within Syria, you find quite a variety. The Assyrian Church of the East, the Chaldean Catholic Church, Syriac Orthodox, Syriac Catholic, various Protestant groups too.
And the Assyrian Church of the East claims very early origins, apostolic.
They do. They trace roots back to Thomas, Addai, and Bartholomew. And classical Syriac serves as that unifying liturgical language across many of them, keeping that linguistic link strong in their religious practice.
So these churches are much more than just places of worship. They're cultural and spiritual anchors.
Precisely. And beyond formal services, their culture is rich with unique traditions. Major Christian holidays, of course, but also ancient festivals like Rosh Hashanah, the Assyrian New Year.
Akitu, right.
Akitu, yeah. Big celebrations, parades, traditional clothing, dancing, connecting them right back to Mesopotamia. And then you have specific traditions around weddings, particularly in the Kabor region. Kalo di Sulaka, Nikwita, Dwaketara. These unique customs.
It sounds like a really vibrant cultural fabric. So these different denominations, despite theological differences, they're united in preserving heritage, language, social cohesion, especially when facing persecution.
That's right. They provide a vital infrastructure for cultural survival, which is exactly why attacks on churches during the Civil War weren't just religious persecution. They were assaults on the very foundations of Assyrian identity and community life.
It's all interconnected. Now, given this long history and distinct culture, what about their contributions to Syrian society overall?
Well, as we touched on, their historical role in state building, administration, the translation movement, immense. Yeah. And economically, especially in the Kabor region's agriculture, they've sustained communities for centuries. Wheat, grapes, apples, dairy.
And culturally, through their traditions, music, schools.
Absolutely. Cultural enrichment through all that, plus community institutions, sports clubs initially, and Kamishli, later Tel Tamer. Their heritage is often described as a life cord, connecting modern Syria back to its ancient history.
But there's a paradox there, isn't there? Historical value acknowledged, yet they face modern marginalization, land confiscation, political disenfranchisement.
Exactly. It highlights this real tension in Syrian nation building. There seems to be this selective embrace of ancient heritage, while simultaneously suppressing the contemporary ethnic and political identity of Assyrians, often viewing them just as a minority, not a constituent people with their own rights.
Implying maybe deliberate cultural erasure, othering.
It certainly looks that way sometimes, yeah. A very troubling dynamic.
Okay, let's shift focus now to their political representation and engagement within this complex Syrian landscape.
Right. Assyrian politics mainly flows through a few key organizations, each with its own history, its own approach. Mm-hmm. The Assyrian Democratic Organization, ADO, founded way back in 1957, oldest one in Syria.
Founded by students, right, aiming to safeguard Assyrian existence against Pan-Arabism.
Exactly. Initially neutral in the Civil War, ADO later opposed Assad, joined the Syrian National Coalition. They advocate for a civil, secular Syria, favorable relations with the West, especially the U.S.
Then there's the Syriac Union Party, SUP, founded 2005. They're different.
Yeah, SUP is secular, committed to this Doranoye modernization ideology. They aligned with the Kurdish PYD and the ANES during the war, shared ideology, secular pro-modernization, direct democracy.
And they hold seats in the ANES legislature.
3 deputies in the Syrian Democratic Council, yes. And significantly, they rejected the proposed new Syrian constitution, saying it just entrenches exclusion. They also set up their own security forces, Sutoro Police, and the Syriac Military Council, MFS.
Okay. And the third main one, the Assyrian Democratic Party, ADP, a splinter from ADO.
Right, formed in 78, traditionally represented Eastern Assyrian interests, Kabor Valley mainly. They've generally sided with the Ba'athist government since the 90s, supported pro-government militias in the war.
But their stance has evolved a bit.
It seems so. While traditionally representing Eastern Assyrians, they initially even viewed them as the only true Assyrians. They've become more inclusive. Worked with other Christian groups in Al-Asaka, and interestingly, expressed support for Syria's federalization since 2017, despite being generally pro-government.
It's a complex, sometimes contradictory picture. Navigating this must be incredibly perilous for these organizations. This constant struggle for recognition, autonomy, just basic protection.
It is. You see these differing approaches, ADO with the opposition, SUP with ADOs, ADP with the government. It reflects the incredibly difficult choices, the lack of a unified front. Alliance is often based on perceived security, viability in a volatile situation.
And facing pressure from all
Yeah.
sides, marginalization, lack of real influence,
Yeah.
caught between Damascus's Arabization and the AD's agenda.
Exactly. We've seen SUP members arrested by the Assad government. And within ADS, despite the alliance, there are real concerns about direct Assyrian representation. ADS sometimes positions itself as the voice for all Christians, which ignores the specific Assyrian identity and their desire for direct engagement, say, with Western governments.
That historical experience of being othered, that must feed into this cautious engagement. And the fact that both SUP and ADO rejected the new constitution draft, that speaks volumes about their ongoing concerns.
It really does. It underscores their consistent push for genuine participation for all groups, recognition of Syria's pluralism. That U.S.-mediated agreement in 2022 between ADO and SUP, that seems like a really significant step, trying to bolster cooperation, preserve their communities together.
A crucial move towards unity, definitely. Now let's turn to one of the most devastating periods, their experiences during the Syrian Civil War.
Yeah, the war since 2011. Catastrophic impact, massive displacement, profound demographic shifts for Assyrians. Pre-war estimates were in the hundreds of thousands, maybe 400,000, up to over 800,000.
And so many long-established communities just uprooted. By 2022, millions of Syrians displaced overall, including huge numbers of Assyrians fleeing to neighboring countries, or further afield North America, Europe, Australia.
And it's crucial to understand this wasn't random. It was a direct result of widespread atrocities by all sides. Assad's crackdown, then the rise of ISIS with its extreme sectarianism, created a particularly lethal environment for minorities like Assyrians.
That February 2015 ISIS attack on the Kabul River villages, just horrific. 35 villages attacked, 253 Assyrians kidnapped.
Yes, around 3,000 displaced just from that one offensive. 11 churches destroyed. It left a profound scar, depopulating historically vital areas.
The loss of their agricultural livelihoods there, the scattering of communities, huge threats to cultural coherence, long-term survival, some villages left with just a few families.
Sadly, yes, it's devastating.
And beyond displacement, just horrific targeted violence and persecution, especially from ISIS and other militants.
Tragically so. ISIS systematically targeted Assyrian Christian communities. Their ideology saw artifacts, religious sites as idolatrous, so we saw deliberate destruction. The Virgin Mary Church in Tel Nasri, the Armenian Genocide Memorial in Deir ez-Zor.
Some abductions too. Kabul, Qaryatayn.
Yes, Qaryatayn near Homs in August 2015. At least 230 people, including dozens of Assyrian Christians, imposing jizya, that old tax on non-Muslims, other religious restrictions, tools of persecution.
And it wasn't just ISIS, right? Other factions involved in abuses, regime forces, opposition groups.
Reports indicate abuses by others too, yes. The Syrian regime and Russian forces implicated in unlawful killings, torture, arbitrary detentions. The Assyrian Human Rights Network documented cases of severe violence by Syrian authorities, and some opposition groups, like the Syrian National Army, also accused of abductions, sexual violence, torture.
Even accusations against the SDF, desecrating churches, cemeteries.
There have been accusations, yes. Things like digging trenches near sites, using them for military positions, which endangers civilians and potentially provokes Turkish retaliation. It just highlights their extreme vulnerability, caught between all these competing powers. Their distinct identity made them targets.
So in response to this violence and lack of protection, Assyrian self-defense forces emerged, SUP playing a key role.
Yes. Faced with escalating violence, lack of state protection, they formed local forces. Sutoro, the Syriac Security Office, emerged in NAS areas from 2012, often worked with the Rojavan Isaish police, affiliated with SUP.
And that's distinct from Sutoro.
Yes, Sutoro is a different breakaway faction in Kamishli, aligned with the Syrian government.
Okay. And the Syriac Military Council, MFS SUP's armed wing.
That's right. Cooperated with the YPG, became part of the wider Syrian Democratic Forces, the SDF. They even have a female brigade, the Beth and Rain Women's Protection Forces, mainly in guard roles.
And other groups too. Guzzardo Protection Force Sutoro, aligned with the government, Kabul Guards.
Yes. GPF Sutoro, mainly Assyrian, but some Armenians, aligned with Damascus, clashed with ISIS, but also sometimes with Kurdish forces. The ADP supported them, and the Kabul Guards and Natora, affiliated with ADP, joined the SDF. The PYD actually handed over control of Kabul villages to them in 2017, though the YPG kept a base nearby.
The very fact they formed these forces shows their determination to protect themselves. But having different groups align with different powers must have deepened internal divisions.
It certainly reflected them and perhaps exacerbated them in some ways. Different groups seeking security through different, often competing alliances.
And adding another layer of tragedy, the impact on their cultural heritage sites.
Truly heartbreaking. ISIS, especially, deliberately targeted Assyrian heritage, driven by that iconoclastic ideology, smashing artifacts in the Mosul Museum.
That video was shocking.
Yeah, and the systematic demolition of ancient Assyrian capitals in Iraq. Nineveh, Nimrud, Khorsabad. Nimrud, they started demolishing it March 2015, bulldozing palaces, smashing Lamassu statues, 90% of the excavated zone destroyed.
Unbelievable.
Nineveh, destruction of walls, winged bull statues, blowing up churches in Syria too, like the 7th century Green Church in Tikrit, the Virgin Mary Church in Tel Nasri, even looting ancient sites like Tel Ajajah, destroying statues, selling artifacts. Raga, they ordered the bulldozing of colossal Assyrian gateway lions.
It wasn't just vandalism, was it? It felt like a deliberate campaign to erase their history, undermine their identity.
Precisely. Eradicate their heritage, a symbol contradicting ISIS ideology. Inflict pain on the West too, perhaps, and profit from looting. Targeting churches was direct assault on their cultural and social infrastructure, aiming for erasure, forced assimilation.
Such a profound loss. Thankfully, there are efforts, like the Smithsonian's SOSI project, trying to document and preserve what's left. Now, shifting to the present. What are the biggest challenges facing Assyrians in Syria right now?
Oh, the list is long and deeply concerning. Severe economic hardship is huge. Syria's economy is devastated, GDP down over 60% since 2011, hyperinflation, currency collapse, banking crisis.
Poverty rates are staggering.
Over 90% below the poverty line, nearly 13 million food insecure. Infrastructure destroyed, roads, schools, hospitals, essential services crippled.
And in the northeast, where many Assyrians live, electricity, water.
Huge problems. Early 2024 reports suggested over 1 million without reliable electricity, over 2 million with limited safe water. Turkey's airstrikes destroyed more health centers, power stations. The agricultural sector in Kabul, their backbone. Crippled. Food shortages.
So they're surviving mainly on diaspora funds.
Largely, yes. Extreme financial stress, minimal local economic support. This precarity fuels ongoing displacement, hinders any refugee return.
And the land confiscation issue? Property rights violations. Still happening.
Yes, a severe systemic challenge, particularly in ancestral lands. Reports keep coming of Assyrian properties targeted by real estate fraud, often involving Kurdish claimants allegedly linked to KRG or ANEs, falsifying deeds.
Exploiting the legal system.
Seems like it.
Yeah.
Leaving rightful owners defenseless against institutionalized dispossession. Estimates suggest maybe 15% of Assyrian lands in ANEs areas seized through land grabs, with promises of return unfulfilled. Challenging it in ANEs courts is difficult delays, prohibitive fees.
It wasn't just ANEs, though. The old Syrian regime had laws impacting property, too.
Yes, seizing assets from political opponents, sometimes under the pretext of terrorism or urban expansion. While Assad's fall might annul some illegal contracts, seized properties remain a complex legal mess. The Assyrian Policy Institute keeps highlighting the need for property rights protection.
It sounds like a systematic campaign for ethnic cleansing, frankly. And the educational challenges continue, too, threatening cultural survival.
Profoundly. That effective ban on their traditional curriculum, harassment of teachers by Kurdish authorities, pressure to teach Kurdish. It's created that impossible dilemma we talked about, trapped between the Syrian curriculum they reject and the ANE's curriculum they find problematic and potentially dangerous.
Many schools just shut down.
Exactly. It's a direct assault on identity, self-determination, aiming for assimilation. Again, diaspora groups like the Assyrian Aid Society of Iraq are vital, funding lecturers, textbooks.
And politically, still marginalized, lacking real representation.
Yes, significant political marginalization continues, both under the Syrian government and within ANEs. Their right to self-determination, despite history, indigenous status, often ignored.
And ANEs actively blocks direct engagement between Assyrians and Western governments, positioning itself as representing all Christians.
That's what reports suggest, yes. This tokenism prevents genuine Assyrian voices from being heard, their specific concerns addressed. We still hear of repression, arrests, torture of ADO and ADP members by the Assad regime, and under ADNEs, advocating for basic rights can get you labeled pro-Assad or pro-Turkey, justifying more oppression.
Which explains why Assyrian parties rejected that new constitutional declaration.
Absolutely. Concerns about continued exclusion, marginalization. The declaration's emphasis on Islamic jurisprudence requiring a Muslim president, keeping the name Syrian Arab Republic, All points of contention, no constitutional recognition as a constituent people, manipulation of political seats by proxies. It effectively silences the community, obstructs self-determination. API keeps calling for recognition as a constituent people, protection of free speech, including language rights.
Ongoing disenfranchisement, violence against outspoken Assyrians, severe repression, urgent need for intervention, self-administration. So, despite all this, what are the prospects? Any glimmers of hope?
Well, despite everything, the resilience of the Assyrian people is remarkable. Their determination to maintain culture, identity, it's powerful. Local churches, especially the Assyrian Church of the East in Kabul, are vital anchors: faith, culture, heritage, language.
Those identity markers, Aramaic language, Christian faith, ties to ancestral land must be incredibly important for a stateless, displaced people.
Hugely important. And traditions like Akitu, the New Year, wedding ceremonies, they're living links unifying fragmented communities inside Syria and in the diaspora. Folklore, music, preserving collective memory. It's about community resilience, using resources to respond, recover from adversity, social cohesion, well-being, efforts to localize aid, invest in civil society.
And the diaspora's role seems absolutely central.
Indispensable, really. Those large communities abroad are a bulwark. Crucial financial support. Assyrians in Syria often survive primarily on diaspora funds. Organizations like Assyrian Aid Society of Iraq, entirely diaspora funded.
And political advocacy, raising awareness.
Yeah. Critical role. Groups like the Assyrian Policy Institute in the U.S., advocating for rights, trying to influence U.S. policy. API has specific recommendations for Syria. The Assyrian Universal Alliance, AUA, member of UNPO, advocating globally. International support, though often insufficient, is vital. Calls for the UN human rights groups to fund initiatives supporting their presence.
Like the Smithsonian's SOSI project for cultural preservation.
Exactly. Training experts, creating digital records, supported by the U.S. State Department. But there's a need for more international cooperation, flexible partnerships, and that challenge remains. Lack of direct engagement between Western governments and Assyrian communities, often mediated by others.
So what about pathways to actual recognition, self-determination?
Securing recognition as a constituent people, not just a minority, is fundamental. That means affirming indigenous status, historical claims. It needs concrete measures. Protecting property rights, freedom of speech, cultural expression.
And self-administration, autonomous regions.
Widely seen as essential for sustaining their presence. Proposals like those for the Nineveh Plain in Iraq. Maybe something similar could promote stability, inclusion in parts of Syria. But the political landscape is so fragmented. A post-Assad Syria needs a genuine national dialogue. Credible, inclusive, non-sectarian governance, free fair elections, safe, voluntary refugee return. Core principles.
But doubts remain about the inclusivity of groups like HTS now controlling Idlib.
Serious doubts, yes.
Yeah.
Maybe learning from successful community models, like the Ismaili experience. Establishing a national council, Syriac, Chaldean, Assyrian. A strong diaspora lobby. Financial institutions, sustainable investments, cultural festivals, diplomatic engagement.
A global network connecting everyone.
Exactly. National revival needs a clear vision, unity, organization, strategic planning. It's a huge task.
A long and incredibly challenging path, definitely. But their enduring spirit, community strength, it seems like a powerful force.
Indeed it is.
So, to wrap up our deep dive today, the Assyrian people in Syria had this profound history, a distinct identity rooted deep in ancient Mesopotamia and early Christianity. Despite centuries of persecution culminating in the Syrian War's devastating impact, they show remarkable resilience.
And hopefully you now have a deeper understanding of their story. The enduring challenges, cultural erasure, political marginalization, and their aspirations for recognition, for self-determination in their homeland.
And finally, a thought to leave you with. Considering their deep historical roots, their ongoing struggle, what does the future really look like for indigenous minority groups like the Assyrians in regions fractured by conflict and competing nationalisms? And perhaps more pointedly, what role can or should the international community play in ensuring their survival and the continuity of their unique cultural heritage? Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.